Okay, we're going to begin talking about the Russian Revolution. You're going to be completing a Nearpod assignment using some of the information from this video and some other videos and a lot of other information document-wise. And so what we need to do first, before we can really get into the whole detail of what caused the Russian Revolution, is we need to talk about what caused it. So what took Russia from this setup under the imperial czars, the Russian Empire, 1913, till we got to this one, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and this is a map from 1950. And as you can see, it's not a terrible bit different, but they do organize it somewhat differently. And we'll talk about all that. Okay, so one thing you got to be clear on with the Russian czars, and we talked about the czars last year with Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, but there are obviously a whole string of a family that lasts up until 1917. The Russian czars are autocrats, absolute rulers. After the rule of Catherine the Great, the power of the czar is unquestioned until the early 1800s. The ideas of the French Revolution stirred a few Russian thinkers to challenge the czars and the laws and the custom that oppressed the lower classes. The first of these is what's called the Decembrist Revolt. And in December of 1825, after the death of Tsar Alexander I, who was the guy who fought against Napoleon, a group of army officers with liberal ideas attempt to take power. There's a new Tsar, Nicholas I, the son of Alexander I, and the Decembrists, as the officers became known, hoped to gain power and establish a constitutional monarchy and also abolish serfdom, because Russia still has serfdom. This is one of the similarities between Russia and actually the United States, because the United States and Russia are the two of the largest state countries that have people in bondage. Okay, the revolt fails, and it leads Nicholas to take what is a hard right turn. He suppresses all liberal and revolutionary ideas in Russia. Okay, serfdom is a major problem in Russia. We've talked a lot about serfdom. You should remember from last year especially what serfdom meant. Peasants form the majority of the Russian population. There are free people, but serfdom still exists, and the serfs are not permitted to leave the land on their own free will. They can't even marry without consent of the landlord. Many peasants who are not serfs disapproved of the system. Okay, but this whole system begins to start crashing down or coming down later on in the middle of the 19th century, and one of the factors is the Crimean War. The Russians are defeated by the Ottoman Turks in the Crimean War. The Crimea, as you might be familiar with because it's been in the news a lot, is a peninsula into the Black Sea north of Turkey. It used to be Ukraine. It is now part of Russia because the Russians took it from the Ukrainians 2 years ago. The Russian army had inferior technology and railroads, and the Russian population is humiliated by the defeat, and they begin to lose faith in the government. Okay, you get a new Tsar shortly after this, Alexander II. Nicholas dies in 1855, and he was replaced by his son Alexander. Alexander was a liberal thinker, and he abolishes serfdom in 1861. So before the United States gets rid of slavery, the Russians get rid of serfdom. People can no longer be sold. They can marry who they wish, own property, and go into occupations and businesses. He also reduced the power of the nobility. He set up local assemblies called zemstvos with representation from the nobles and peasants and townspeople. Alexander set up a judicial system based on equality and trial by jury, and he also required public education of elementary children. Unfortunately, his reforms still left peasants with very little economic success, and the life of peasants is difficult with few economic opportunities. So they're no longer serfs, and they supposedly have some rights, but they are so far down on the economic ladder that it's very difficult for them to climb out. Okay, this brings revolution. And there's a couple of factors that lead to this. Okay, the first is what's known as Russification, and he is not the first to try it, and he's certainly not the last. By the late 1800s, Russia has a vast empire. You know what it looks like on the map. It's the largest piece of land country on the planet. And the Tsars attempt to maintain a tight control over minorities while promoting Russian unity. And the way they do this is what a policy of called Russification. They try to basically make everybody into Russians. They want them to think, act, and believe as Russians. Alexander III, who is the son of Alexander II, who Alexander II is assassinated, as goes the ways of a lot of reformers. Somebody decides to take them out because the reforms aren't going fast enough, or they don't like the reforms. His son Alexander III takes over, and he is a hard right-winger. He persecutes non-Russians. He insisted on one language, Russian, and one church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. He persecutes Jews. He doesn't allow them into different occupations, and he also regulates where they could live. These policies encourage violent attacks of Jews called pogroms, and the authorities stand by and watch as the homes and businesses of Jews were destroyed. This leads to a migration of Jews, both to the New World, but also into Europe, or to the eastern parts of the Russian Empire, which makes them easy targets later in the 1940s for the Nazis because they're consolidated into certain places, predominantly in Poland. Okay, some long-term causes of the revolution. Okay, absolute rulers. Alexander III and his son Nicholas II sought to industrialize Russia with Western ideas. They're trying to catch up with the rest of the world, and at the same time, they try to block political forms from the West. They use harsh tactics such as secret police to suppress reform. As we've seen already, industrialization brings people wanting more. They have more money, they want more jobs, they want protections. The Tsars tried to keep any of this from happening. There's peasant unrest. In the early 1900s, the rigid class system still existed in Russia. The peasants are too poor to buy land, and many of them are angry by that, and angry by industrialization, and they're being forced to leave land to work in horrible conditions in factories. These people move to the cities and become factory workers where they work long hours, receive low pay, and put up with unsafe condition. And it's among these workers that the socialist ideas begin to spread and gain popularity. Just like in England, just like in continental Europe, socialism begins to spread because it talks about equality for workers. And then, of course, nationalism. Same as in Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, you have a lot of ethnic minorities who don't like Russia and they don't like the idea of Russification, so they hold on to their ethnic cultures, and there's pockets of these groups who want their own countries and states. The Soviet Union will actually try to address that to some extent. So you have a first revolution in 1905, before World War I. Russia loses a war to Japan over some territory in the Far East. It triggers a crisis in Russia. And on Sunday, January 22nd, 1905, peaceful marchers carrying a petition to reform were shot down by the Tsar's troops. Bloody Sunday, it's the first of several Bloody Sundays, destroyed the people's faith in the Tsar, and strikes and revolts exploded around the country. Up until this point, people always thought that if we could just appeal directly to the Tsar, to our little father, he would make everything right, but it's his advisors. When it's the Tsar's own troops that are out in the streets riding these people down and hacking them down with sabers, they finally come to the realization that the Tsar is one of these people that want to oppress them. Facing the chaos of this revolution, Nicholas makes some changes. He agrees to reforms. He promises to grant more rights, such as freedom of speech. He agrees to set up a national legislature called the Duma. However, the Duma has very limited power and did little to relieve the peasant and worker discontent, and the pogroms of the Jews and other ethnic groups continue. So he plays some lip service to things, but nothing really changes. World War I will become the spark that will start the Russian people on the road to actual revolution and getting rid of the Tsar's government. Okay, Russia, as we know, is one of the Allied powers. With little industry, they really aren't ready to fight the war, and supplies, food, and weapons are unavailable, and the soldiers lose faith in the Tsar because they're starving, they're cold, and they're losing. In March of 1917, there's a revolt in St. Petersburg, the capital of Russia. Rioters in the streets demand bread. The Tsar's soldiers refuse to fire on the people. And and the whole thing collapses. Nicholas abdicates the throne or gives up his rule in March of 1917. After the removal of Nicholas, Duma officials set up a provisional or a temporary government. The new government makes some mistakes when it continues the war against Germany. So you continue to have this drag on everything of the war, and it's very unpopular with the Russian people. Later comes the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks were a group of radical socialists, okay, and they respond to the ineffectiveness of this new provisional government that takes over after the Czar, and they begin to plot changes. They set up Soviets or councils of workers or soldiers in all the Russian cities, and soon these are taken over by the Bolsheviks, by a radical socialist party. Following the revolution, an exiled Russian revolutionary, Vladimir Lenin, returns home with some help from the Germans. Lenin has been exiled to Switzerland by the Tsar's government. The Germans get in touch with him, and they offer a peace deal if he'll go back to Russia and lead this revolution, provided he takes Russia out of the war. He agrees and accepts some pretty stiff peace terms, realizing that eventually he will get them back. Lenin, along with Leon Trotsky, had a revolutionary socialist party, what is called the Bolsheviks. They follow the ideas of Karl Marx, but they adapt it to Russia's situation. Lenin gains support amongst many of the people. Peace, land, and bread is what he offers them. They promise to end Russia's involvement in the war, which they do, and they also promise land reform and an end to shortages. They promise to give people back the land. It will turn out much differently. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks led soldiers, sailors, and factory workers in an uprising that overthrows the provisional government in what is known as Red October. The Bolsheviks, called communists, distributed land to the peasants, gave workers control of the factories and mines, and the communists, however, still face a struggle to maintain control of Russia. Okay, we'll get into how they go about doing this in a little bit more detail on the Russian in the Near Pod, which you now need to begin.